Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our 82nd Wednesday webinar. Would you have ever believed that we would get as far up as 82 sessions? But wondering, where do the topics come from? How do we decide what to do? Well, sometimes it's because of what you ask us to cover. So if you go to our evaluation at the end of the session, it'll ask you, are there any webinars you want us to do? But sometimes it comes from the team. So tonight's webinar actually came as an idea from Brett, who is a team member. So Brett, do you want to tell us a little bit about where the idea for tonight came from? Because I'm always saying to the team, Alma, what's going to be helpful to you in your studies? And you found tonight's session you suggested for the team. So tell us a bit about why.
Yeah, so back at the beginning of this semester at university, we were given sort of like a mini assignment to do, and we had to pick a topic and write a small assignment on it and then post it to our sort of community notice board. And I had chosen domestic violence, but I was given an option to do it from the male perspective, which I felt is something that's not covered very often in lectures. I mean, I've had several from sort of the female perspective, but there's never really been much mention of male victim domestic violence. So I saw a TEDx talk by tonight's guest and then reached out to Andrew and asked him would he be interested in doing a webinar for us tonight, and he's agreed to. So
it's always great when we reach out to people as well and people are willing to give of their time and be supportive and helpful. And I know you found the TEDx talk really helpful. And I'm going to hand straight over to Andrew. Andrew, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. I'm going to let you guide us through tonight. And thank you ever so much for agreeing to come and join us and giving up your evening. So thank you, Andrew. I'm handing over to you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. As many of us will already know, domestic abuse reportedly costs the British economy £66 billion when you add up the cost on the victims themselves and the wider impact at work and on families and on services and resources. And you probably picked up on a lot of the stories about domestic abuse that are in the press at the moment. We can't miss, can we, the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard saga that seems to rumble on. Obviously, Depp took the Sun to court in 2018. They published an article about him being a wife beater. He took them to court, suing them for libel. He lost at court. The only key witness was Amber Heard. She was the key witness. And the view of the Johnny Depp team was there were so many witnesses that could have discredited her accounts that didn't give evidence in court. But now the case is back in America, where he is now suing Amber Heard herself for a blog where she insinuated that Johnny Depp had been abusive towards her. And of course, that's lost revenue for Johnny Depp. And now that's being played out in the American courts with all the witnesses there. And it's a tough one, really. I think there's I do know of some groups that are sort of hanging on to which way is this going to go. There's some people that feel that Amber Heard, who's been sort of branded as having a personality disorder, this is what happens to women when they're, when they are themselves the victim of domestic abuse. There's other people that would say, actually, Johnny Depp has suffered really some quite nasty violence. There are others that would just say it's surely just a dysfunctional relationship. But it's rumbling on and it keeps domestic abuse in the press. Some of you will recall the Caroline Flack case, where tragically she completed suicide. The police were called to her flat. She had assaulted her partner with a lamp. There was evidence of that, and the Crown Prosecution Service were accused of sort of launching some kind of show trial. But where there's evidence of domestic abuse, they have to prosecute. Some of you who are like, I mean, I'm 47 now, I'm showing my age. If you cast your minds even further back, you had the Nigella Lawson and Charles Saatchi case, where Charles Saatchi was seen grabbing Nigella Lawson by the throat. He received an official police caution. Some of you will be aware of the domestic abuse bill last year that was given royal assent, and some of the new clauses in that domestic abuse bill. We now have a new statutory definition of domestic abuse that includes some of the emotional stuff that goes on. It's not just violence. And also certain provisions for victims of domestic abuse, protecting them from being cross-examined by their perpetrators in court, in the family court setting, and other provisions as well. But I wonder what views you have of domestic abuse, because certainly from my experience speaking in the field, and just to be really clear here, I speak about domestic abuse as a lived experience survivor. I am not I don't have any qualifications in social work. I speak from my own experience. But from what I do see, there's a lot of division in the world of domestic abuse, which makes me really sad. There's definitely, I definitely see sort of more men's rights movements saying, well, actually, the majority of victims, if you really add it all up, if you count in the amount of underreporting, it probably is men, not women. And I hear women organisations saying the vast majority of victims of domestic abuse are women. My own view, for what it's worth, looking at the data as we currently have it, I think it's worth just sharing that first before I unpack my story. My own view is that the greater proportion of victims of domestic abuse, as the data would suggest at the moment, would suggest that the greater proportion of victims are indeed women. When I look at the data of the last few years, it tends to be 2/3 women, 1/3 men. Sometimes that goes up to 3/4 women, 1/4 men, but certainly not the overwhelming majority. And some people would say, yeah, but men are the overwhelming majority of perpetrators. It's male. But according to statistics and research carried out by Mankind Initiative, they do advocate for men's rights, but they're a very balanced group. They like to report the truth as much as they can get at it. But of that third of victims who are male victims of domestic abuse, roughly 700,000 victims a year, 1.4 million female victims a year. But of that 700,000 male victims, the view of Mankind Initiative is about 90% of that is female perpetrated, 10% is male perpetrated. And when we think about this sort of 2 million or so reported cases of domestic abuse, is it 2/3 women, 1/3 men, we also have to factor in the LGBT community. We also have to factor in parents abused by their own children, which is a rapidly growing phenomenon. And I am currently a trustee on a charity that supports families where children are indeed the perpetrators of domestic abuse. So my view is that the majority of victims of domestic abuse are women, but I think to say that the vast majority of women is misleading. I do think there's a huge level of underreporting when it comes to men because of the stigma of reporting and the fear of being believed. And I also feel that of the suicide statistics, roughly 6,000 suicide victims in the UK every year, 3/4 of those are men. We know that domestic abuse and parental alienation often go hand in hand, and that those are reasons that do trigger suicide, but they won't be counted. That won't be counted as a domestic homicide. It's not a domestic homicide, it's a suicide. So I do think we need to think more broadly about domestic abuse and the impact. And I do think we need to encourage men as much as we can to speak up, women as well. But we need to have this balanced view where actually it's entirely plausible that men and women could be victims and perpetrators. And so I want to unpack my story, but that's where I stand on it. That's my own view. I don't think it's a particularly extraordinary view. I don't think it's particularly contentious, but that is how I see it. But in unpacking my story, I think it's important to uncover and explore some of the key questions that I tend to get asked. And one of the questions that I tend to get asked is this one. If you're really clever, surely you'd spot that you're in an abusive relationship. Surely you would see it, right? Or maybe people fall into abusive relationships because they fall in love with someone who's amazing and wonderful and charming, and they kind of sort of reel you in like a fish. And if sort of gradually the abuse unfolds, it's a bit of a con, it's a trick. Or maybe they do it very suddenly. In fact, a good friend of mine is female, and she married a guy who he was amazing, and we all thought he was amazing. And then he literally turned after the wedding on the honeymoon, and he was not amazing at all. But in my situation, and I think my situation is quite common, I knew that there were issues with my now ex-wife. I could see it was a troubled relationship. She was at the start of the relationship as she was throughout. It's just, I was the kind of person where I like helping people. And I didn't really have any sense of kind of boundaries on what that looks like. And where you have people who like helping people and don't have clear boundaries, they're going to be a little bit vulnerable to falling into a destructive and abusive relationship, as I was. And so the more I wanted to try and help my my now ex-wife, then girlfriend, the more I just got drawn into this crazy relationship, and I just got sucked into it. And then the more, because I'm the kind of person where I like to just persevere, keep trying, I just kept believing that if I did keep trying, somehow karmically I would be rewarded for my efforts and things would somehow get better, because isn't that what happens? So I think when we think about how people fall into abusive relationship, anyone can fall into an abusive relationship. They might have been conned, or they might not have been conned. They might have gone into it with their eyes wide open. It's just that they like helping people and maybe don't have the strongest of boundaries. But you might say, well, for a male victim, this is why I really logged on for tonight. I get a sense of what it might be like for female victims of domestic abuse. What's it like for a guy stuck in domestic abuse? So let me just unpack a little bit of the story and unpack some of the characteristics of what life was like for me as a man caught in this abusive relationship. So most of what I'm going to reference took place in the south of France. Now, this isn't actually where we lived, because I think I'd rather keep the geography out of it, to protect identities and that kind of stuff. But this looks an awful lot like where we used to live. Very nice town in the south of France. And we were living there, and we had a really nice townhouse, really did. And my wife would do this thing. This gives you an example of kind of starts to unpack what life is like. And at the top of our stairs, we had this big alcove. And I'll refer to her as my wife, because at this point in time, she was my wife. And she had this great idea that I should build some wardrobes into this alcove. And you're probably thinking, that's a great idea. But I'm rubbish at DIY. There's no way I'm going to be able to build a wardrobe. And already my heart is racing, because I can see this is a setup. Because either I suggest someone else does the work. We had plenty of money at that time. Maybe we'll get someone else to build them. But then she'd have been disappointed that I wasn't trying to better myself and learn new skills like all the real proper men that we used to know. And her disappointment generally led to rage and violence. So maybe I could just maybe try and have a go at building the wardrobe. But obviously this is not an easy job, and I'm going to mess it up, which will then lead to rage and violence. So faced with this wonderful choice, I decided I'd have a go at the wardrobes. So I said something like, well, I could have a go. My mind is racing now. I think it's going to take some time and planning. I'm trying to put it off now as much as I can. I have a go at it. So for weeks, I did some drawings. I even bought some timber without the slightest intention of doing the job. And of course, 4 or 5 weeks in, when nothing's got done, all hell broke loose. Things flying, fists flying, feet flying. And that was how life was like, where as a victim of domestic abuse, I'm constantly manipulating and thinking myself, making false promises I have no intention of keeping, just to try and keep the peace that day, living in the moment, because that's all you can see beyond. You can't see beyond that day. And this manipulative side to me became a real part of my behavior, constantly trying to think where are the triggers going to be pulled? And therefore, how do I offset the likelihood of those triggers being pulled? Because when you're trying to raise children, you just long for a peaceful home and stability. You don't want it to be screaming rage. You don't want to see your children coming in and seeing you being hit by their mother. You don't want that for your wife either. And so when I broke my wife's favorite wine glass, this isn't the wine glass, of course. This is just an image of a wine glass that looked a bit like the wine glass. It had sentimental value. And I was literally washing it up one day. And you know that thing where you wash up and like the stem just comes off. It's like, I've broken the wine glass. But I was like, it's that wine glass. Now, I'm blissfully remarried today. And if that happened today, I'd say to my wife, I'm really sorry, I've broken your favorite wine glass. To which she'd be a bit disappointed, and then we'd move on. It'd be fine. It wouldn't be a big deal. It's a wine glass. But back in the day, I was terrified. My heart is now racing. And so thankfully, my wife was out, and I smuggled the evidence of this broken wine glass into my neighbour's recycling bin and breathed a sigh of relief when the truck came the next day and took it away. And that was the kind of behaviour that just became the norm for me, constantly trying to dodge problems as they arose, but manipulating myself in my own space just to always keep the peace. So when I was living in France, this was just before sat-navs were becoming the thing. So it was all about map reading. And my wife would love to go on a scenic route if we were driving somewhere new. Now you might think scenic route, how lovely. For me, scenic route is dangerous, 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 dangerous. Because if we get lost on that map and we can't find our way out of there, and she flips, if I'm driving, she's pushed us off the road by moving my arm and moving my steering wheel and going at me so that I can't even drive. She's then insisted that we stop and stomped off out the car, telling the kids she'll never see them again. And now I'm trying to deal with children crying their eyes out. They're never going to see mum again, trying to reassure them they will see mum again. She'll be back soon, before she stomps back into the car. And then there's just stony silence. I've either got that, or if my wife is driving, she has actually driven us off the road before when she has completely lost the plot. So funnily enough, when my wife is saying, let's go the scenic route, I am determined to keep us on the straight and narrow route, the prepared route. I would rehearse routes obsessively. I became an obsessive planner, an obsessive thinker, and the stress, you never, ever take your eye off the ball. You are always on guard for what could emerge. It's an exhausting way to live. There was violence. It wasn't just kind of like emotional and shouting. The violence wasn't every week, every fortnight for me. In truth, it was probably every couple of months, but it was bad when it occurred. This wasn't the candlestick that she slammed over my head in sort of an Agatha Christie type. And I know a candlestick sounds like a story from Agatha Christie, but when that was slammed over my head, I remember the first time it hit me over the head. I remember thinking, if I take another one of those, I am out cold or worse. So when she came at me again, I held her arms. I remember holding on. She was really strong, pushing against me, trying to get another blow on my head. And I held her tight. Then interestingly, the next day, she had marks on her wrists from my hands. And then, of course, they were shown on the school run with the accusation made that she was being knocked about by me, which is really hard. Then when I'm then doing that school run, just the audacity of it, the painfulness of it, when I'm myself am sporting a huge lump on my head from the candlestick. Everyday objects, fists, teeth biting, this was the norm. It's not just violence. Domestic, when you're caught in an abusive relationship, if you had prior to that relationship close friendships and family and really strong relationships with other people, that's bad news for an abusive person, because your close family and friends, that's a possible wake-up call. And an abusive person doesn't want a wake-up call kicking about. They don't. So over time, they'll erode those relationships. Now, I honestly came to believe that my parents, my sisters, who I had previously adored and loved and been very close to, that they wanted me to remain a little boy. And that in order to be mature and the main man, I needed to just have less contact, because I always reverted back into little boy mode when I was with them. That's what my ex-wife had me believe. And so increasingly I became alienated and isolated, and I think this is common for women or men caught in abusive relationships. You start to distance yourself from the people you were once close to. There's the gaslighting. Now, we know what gaslighting is in the sense that you start to doubt your own sanity and judgment. We see this in politics. We see this in abusive relationships. So let me give you an example of this, how this plays out. So I remember my ex-wife, we're in France, and she was a great with hospitality. We'd always have friends over and whatever. And she was very hospitable, a great host. But she'd love to sort of hold forth and have the center of be the center of attention. And I remember her telling this story to the people around the table about where she'd been on a teacher training course in a part of the UK that's very deprived. And everyone was listening to her. It was a great story. And then she told them that 95% of people that lived in this area were drug addicts. I mean, I remember the statistics. I remember she said it, like everyone was like, what? Like there's nowhere in the world where 95% of people are drug addicts. And it just felt like she lost the people around the table. They weren't so interested anymore. And so I plucked up some courage that evening. And I just like, love, when you're sort of delivering statistics, that just doesn't sound right. And maybe you want to just like research or just have a look, make sure it's like sort of accurate. She did go crazy. She didn't physically attack me. But her whole comeback on that was, I am just so pedantic. I try and spoil everything. I take myself so seriously. It's having an impact on the children as well. And so I didn't walk away from that thinking that I was right, or I just thought I am so pedantic. I ended up apologizing to her. And that is how gaslighting works. They turn the problems back on you. They make you believe it's all your fault. They get you to a point where you just doubt everything. And so you just blindly follow what your abusive partner says or does. And they really do, even if you're a clever person, pretty much control your mind. And if it all kicks off, you don't think, oh, this is bad. I should leave. You think this is bad. I'm going to go to counselling and become a better person so I stop provoking my partner. That is how gaslighting works. And my ex-wife, so excuse me, just a cough there, but you might think, well, she's this kind of bully. That's maybe what I'm portraying. Often she was a victim. She had all kinds of illnesses, apparently, a brain tumor the size of an orange, bronchitis, hepatitis C, anorexia. And she had people, not just me, but children, friends, running all over the place to support her, the latest drama that would unfold. And I think that's important to remember, that abusive people aren't always abusive in that kind of bullying, overpowering way. Often it's quite subtle. Often they bully by getting people really, really worried and scared that something's going to happen to them. And that's how they lock you in. Now, you might be thinking, well, mate, that's really bad. Like, so why'd you stay? I mean, you're a guy. You could have just walked out the door. It was straightforward. Why didn't you do that? Well, as I've referred to earlier, you think it's your fault. So if you think it's your fault, you're not going to leave because it's your fault. You're just going to keep trying to work on yourself and make yourself that better person. I was constantly referring to self-help books. I was in counselling to become that better person for several years. I could never quite find out how to become that better person. I kept trying. The other reason many men, but women as well, don't want to leave is the fear of the family courts. Because we all know the family courts are a bit of a lottery. It depends on the Kafkas officer that you get. It depends on the judge that you get. What if this abusive person that you're in a relationship, let's say you're beginning to wake up and smell the coffee now, you're sensing that you need to take action. But actually, what if they make accusations and you can't see your kids anymore? Or for me, I knew that I would have to move out. So suddenly I go from living with my children every day and having an active role in their upbringing to only seeing them every other week. And I have to fight tooth and nail for that. That's a lot of reason why people stay. Sometimes people stay because their kids are settled in their schools. They like their dog and their cat. They like their house. They like their friends. So to walk away, all that upheaval, all the guilt, when your confidence is shot to pieces anyway by everything that you've been through, it's not surprising that men and women get so stuck for so long. I mentioned about waking up and smelling the coffee. I think this is important as well because the society has this belief, I suppose, that it's encouraged that we just keep trying and we try our best and we persevere. We don't want to hear about people that had a go at something and then gave up. Can you imagine getting an after dinner speaker for an event? And the main story was that this person, they tried something, didn't work out, they gave up. You'd be like, that's not much of an after dinner talk. I was hoping for a bit more from my after dinner speaker. I wanted to hear about someone that defied the odds. Dave with the bad back, he was scared of heights, but somehow he scaled Everest in only his underpants. I want to know how he did it so I too can feel inspired to do this. And the world has this emphasis on perseverance, but unchecked perseverance is dangerous. And I just wanted to keep trying because that was my mindset at the time. I now have a much better relationship with perseverance and when to walk away and when to keep trying, but under what terms. But at that time, I didn't. I just thought, well, if you keep trying, it will all kind of work itself out. It's known as optimism bias as well, where you have this ridiculously optimistic sense that things will be okay, even though the evidence shows quite the opposite. And optimism bias plays itself out in all kinds of fields of planning, of construction, of business and relationships. Now you might think, yeah, but when you did leave, you've now left, you're in a better place now, right? And I am absolutely, I'm blissfully remarried. We got 3 boys under 9. I have rebuilt, and that's grand. But when you leave, I liken it to, you have to be prepared to crawl through the mud and the slime to get to the green pastures on the other side of the hill. It's going to be awful for a while. That's reality. Some of the reason it's going to be awful, for me, it was difficult coming out of that relationship, to be honest. I used to play football quite a bit. I still do, actually. And in the locker room, there's all this kind of talk about who needs a kitchen pass, who, you know, you big girls blouse and manning up. And this doesn't help if you have someone like me where I felt like an idiot anyway. I felt completely emasculated anyway. What kind of a man would allow himself to be in this situation and to have let it get so out of control? And so one of the challenges for me was just keeping it all to myself. Having gone through this experience, I didn't really want to open up and be honest with family and friends. many of whom could see what I had been through, but I just wasn't up for talking. Also, when you come out of an abusive relationship, there's so many different directions you could go in. Let's just say, for example, this is a dilemma. Let's just say you're a guy, you've left an abusive relationship, you've had a couple of kids with your wife. It is your wife who was your abuser. Let's just say you've been living in London, but your wife now moves to Birmingham. So what do? Do you also move to Birmingham, try and set up a new home there, new friends, new job? But what if she then moves to York? Are you then going to have to move to York? Or do you just stay in London and just see what happens and just accept that your kids now live in York? Very difficult to know, well, how do I put my foot forward? Which is the right foot to put forward? I don't know which way this is going to go. Getting unraveled from bank accounts. Let me tell you, when you have joint bank accounts with an abusive person that wants to take revenge on you, it is no picnic getting out of that and starting to unravel all these things that you've been joined together in. It's a really difficult time. Technology, that's the other thing. If I would, at the time that I left, I was out of the relationship in 2008. Technology wasn't quite as advanced as it is today. But now, if you leave, you need a new phone. You need a new laptop. You need a new iPad. You need a new technical everything. Otherwise, there is a huge risk that your perpetrator will know exactly where you are and what you're doing. And these things it's so much to think about when you're going through that difficult time. Technology. So I've mentioned technology. The other reason why people struggle after that relationship is this actually isn't a photograph of the courtroom, but it looks a lot like the courtroom that I've spent an awful lot of time in. I have spent so much time in the family courts and money. It really, really pains me. And parental alienation, it's where either the abusive parent tries to spoil the relationship with your children, with the decent, loving parent, either by blocking contact, frustrating contact, or simply by trying to get the children to dislike their parent. Now, there is controversy around parental alienation. Some people say it doesn't exist. I think the evidence is very clear that it does exist. Some people have issues with the title parental alienation. I think that's just pedantics. But let me tell you how parental alienation works as you come out of an abusive relationship, because parental alienation and domestic abuse, they go hand in hand, because once the loving parent has left that relationship, the abusive person will want revenge. That spite's got to go somewhere, and it will usually go into sort of psychological warfare over the children. But on a real silly example, so we'd moved back to the UK now, and my daughters at the time were living with mum, my ex-wife, down in Somerset Way. I was living in Birmingham. And so every other Friday, I'd go down the motorway, pick the girls up, bring them back to Birmingham. They'd have the weekend with me. I'd take them back on Sunday. So every Sunday, they're going back in an outfit from Birmingham. Every Friday, I'm bringing them up in their school uniform. So what I do as a decent father is the school uniform is washed, clean, pressed, not pressed, I wouldn't go that far, washed, clean, in a bag with the shoes. They go back with the kids on Sunday. But none of when I say my outfits, my daughter's outfits, but Birmingham outfits were coming back. So very quickly, I ran out of clothes. I didn't have a lot of money at the time. My business had collapsed in the recession. So I'd make a request, please, can I have some of my outfits back? They can come back every time. I don't mind. It's good that the girls have these clothes where they live with you 12 days out of 14, but I do need to be able to clothe them when I've got them, and I am having them in the holidays. Do you think the clothes came back? Of course they didn't. I'm constantly shelling out, and I'm pleading, please, can some clothes come back? They didn't come back. So in the end, I had to send the girls back. I made the decision to send the girls back in their school uniform. And then they're going to say, why are you sending us back in your school uniform? They get sent back in the school uniform. Mum is now slating me. And my daughters are asking me, why? Why are we having to wear our school uniform? Those questions get very difficult to answer. And you're faced with questions that, if you say the wrong thing, that's not good for the kids. You don't want your kids to have a bad view of the parent. You know that if you say the wrong thing, that could come and bite you on the nose in a family court years down the line. But you are faced with impossible parenting situations. I remember my 9-year-old daughter in a heart-to-heart conversation on one weekend. She was with us. I remember her saying, Daddy, why does mummy always lie? How do I answer that question? I can't say mummy doesn't always lie, because that itself would just be a lie. I can't say, well, yeah, but mummy loves you. Yeah, but why does mummy lie? very, very difficult questions start to emerge when you're trying to co-parent with an abusive person. And my point of mentioning this is, when someone comes out of an abusive relationship, the problems don't stop there and then. It's not like life is now rosy. The problems will continue, particularly if there are children, and you can't just walk away and cut ties. So breathe, pause, resume. I mean, that'd be so nice, wouldn't it? I do think I've paused, breathed, and resumed now. My daughters are older. I have very little contact. So I have no need to have contact with my ex-wife, but she still manipulates in those relationships with our older daughters. And it's just something that I've learned to live with. And when people say to me, does it get better? It's like, it gets better, but the problem itself of having had that relationship with an abusive person, if there are children, that will always be there. That will always throw up problems. That never goes away. And you have to find ways of coming to terms with that and making peace with that. So in a workspace, how do we do more to look after each other? Because I had gone into my workspace for years sporting bruises and cuts, and no one asked anything beyond, hey, what's that with the cut? And when I said, it's another shaving accident, they just assumed it was. And you think, surely there's only so many shaving accidents a guy can have. But so how do we get better at truly supporting each other and having those conversations? Well, there's a few things we can do. I think in general, we can challenge the narrative about domestic abuse. Let's be really clear. Let's be clear about all victims of domestic abuse. Let's be clear in our own not promotional work, but sort of awareness work around domestic abuse. Of course, women are abused by men, and it's awful. And of course, men are abused by women, and it's awful. And of course, parents are abused by their own children, and it's awful. And children are abused by parents. But let's change some of the narrative around domestic abuse. Let's understand that men and women perpetrate. And just because a child is with a woman, it doesn't mean that that woman is not going to be abusing the child. It doesn't mean that it's any less likely, particularly once we start to build those biases and beliefs in our mind, that's when we can miss things in our practice. So I think challenging the narrative is a useful start. We all have biases and prejudice. You know that Wikipedia lists 180 different unconscious biases. Now, I could start going through and explaining each of them. Well, you would be here a long time, so I'm not going to do that. But like in terms of gender bias, even I have gender biases. So when our third boy, like I said, I'm happily married now. And a few years ago, when our third boy was born, my wife, who I'm married to, is a midwife, and she's got a great sense of humor. And she thought she'd wind me up. And she did. We had a home birth, and at the point where she needed some gas. So with a home birth, there's always a midwife on site. So there was about to be an exchange of a midwife, one going home, having done the shift, and a new one joining us. And the gas was about to show up. The doorbell goes. I go to the front door, and it's like this kid. He looks like he's about 16 in his like medical scrubs. I'm thinking, blimey, you're a bit young to be a gas man, but fair enough. Where's the dude? Where's the gas? We need gas. He didn't have any gas. He's like, I'm the midwife. I'm like, I had to sort of take a step back. What? But he walked in. He's a brilliant midwife. My wife suspected that he might be on shift. She just didn't tell me about it. And it took me a while to like, this man is a midwife. He's actually 28. He's happily married, a highly sought after midwife. But I should know better. I still have my own gender biases that I need to work on myself. We all have them, and we have to learn to challenge them and think about them and talk about them so that we're not so biased, even though we will be biased because we're human beings. But the more we talk about and are open about it, the better. I do think that whichever organization you work for, we need to know what the domestic abuse policies are. Every organization should have policies around, well, what happens if there are allegations of domestic, we have a couple that are dating each other within our employer. One is making allegations about the other. What do we even do? We need to know what the protocols are. We need to have those conversations so we know what we would do. And just case in point, in terms of resources, we need to know about where we would point people to. So I've got a couple of numbers here. This is specifically aimed at men. Of course, there's some excellent organizations doing great work for women. But Mankind Initiative, you got National Domestic Abuse Helpline. I particularly would recommend Mankind Initiative, Abused Men in Scotland, Men's Aid Ireland, because they are specific organisations that support male victims of domestic abuse. And those are great resources to pass on. Mankind Initiative in particular doing some amazing research work. And I have so much respect for their passion for accuracy and for just providing a completely balanced view of the data that is there. I really think that's valuable in what can be quite a divisive world. There's also some other names of individuals, resources that I've not on my slide. There's a guide for supporting male victims of domestic abuse by a guy called Lee Marks, who's a great guy, L-E, Marks, as in the word Marks, plural. There's another guy, Robert Wells, a lone sort of campaigner, but again, very balanced in some of his data, which I really respect. We can also help each other more by having a patient attitude, because I have spoken to people where they're like, yeah, but I tried to help Margaret, who was in this dementia, and she wouldn't do anything. I was telling her to leave and she wouldn't leave. The moment when I truly woke up and started to smell the coffee, it was then another 1.5 years till I actually left. It was then actually several years till I'd completely been able to unravel from that situation. So when you have someone in an abusive relationship, it's going to take time for them to unpick it and be at a point where they could move, a lot of time. And it can feel like you're banging your head on the desk, but just bear with and be patient. And of course, we do know statistically that for women in particular, the point of exit and just after is a dangerous time for her. So it's particularly important that if she was to make an exit, that is a very considered exit, so it can be done safely. The statistics tend to show for men in terms of domestic homicide that the risk of that is when they're in the relationship. Once they're out the relationship, the risk drops right off. That's just how it is. How would you know if someone's stuck in an abusive relationship in the workplace, in the working environment? What are the signs? If the person's not talking, that's tricky. But there's just some things that I would say, if you recognize this in a family member, a friend, someone at college, someone at work, these are just some telltale signs. If someone's character has changed, it could be an indication that all is not well. I mean, anything could have provoked their character change, but it might be that is something. I used to be a vibrant, gregarious person with a great sense of humor, quite loud, not overbearingly so, but I completely retreated from myself. I was completely withdrawn. I was underweight. I mean, I'm reasonably slender anyway, but a lot of people often would come up to me saying, mate, you need to go to the doctor. I reckon there could be a real problem here. People often thought I was really had a serious illness. I was so underweight. Socially, I was always the guy that could never quite make it out. Or if I did go out, I could never stay the duration. But I'd always been someone that had. And so little changes of character could be indicators. My employment habits, there was such an impact at work from the domestic abuse. I remember actually one time I was on the phone to a client, and I was a recruitment consultant, and I'd been up in the early hours again trying to deal with my ex-wife. So some outburst had happened, and I remember actually falling asleep on the phone to my client and being caught by my boss asleep, sort of whilst in conversation to my client. I was taking more and more time off work sick. I was disengaged. And in fact, I resigned like about half an hour before I was about to be fired for poor performance. If someone's work performance is really poor, it could be an indicator that all is not well, and domestic abuse might be one of them. Physical signs and scars, obviously, I mean, I had plenty of those on my face, but I think now we have more awareness than perhaps back in, this was 2001, 2002, people weren't picking up on those signs. But also just be mindful of everyone's conversation. More often than not, often you see people chatting and they're also sort of scrolling on their phone, so they're not really paying attention. But pay attention to what your friends and family are saying. And there could be bits and pieces of conversation that indicate quite controlling behavior. And we are okay to challenge that and say, do you know what? That doesn't sound right to me. I'm not sure about that. These are some of the ways that we can look out for each other. Never feel like you don't want to challenge it. As long as you're respectful in your challenge, it's a really helpful thing. It may not be that person responds to that challenge or opens up, but if you hear stuff that doesn't feel right, then challenge it. I'm really big about boundaries and things like that. And I'm really big about knowing the difference between healthy and abusive relationships. So, for example, when I talk about domestic abuse to young people, I just give them working examples like this. Working example number one: if I felt that my wife today hadn't been very affectionate with me for a long time, I could have that conversation with her. I wouldn't need to try and wait for the right moment and try and pluck up the courage to have that I just would have the conversation. If my wife, who I'm married to today, if she said, I'm going to buy a piano, I'd be like, I'm not sure if can we like just think through the finances? I could have that conversation. I wouldn't be thinking, oh yes, let's buy a piano. And then inside I'm thinking, we can't afford that. What are you doing? So know the differences between a healthy and abusive relationship. One of the major differentials is just being able to talk freely and openly about how you feel. In a healthy relationship, you can. In an abusive relationship, you're constantly treading on eggshells, trying to plan your script so you don't say the wrong word, trying to get it at the right time exactly, just in case it all blows up and goes out of control. Or you just don't have the conversations and you just do whatever your partner says. But know those differences. And with boundaries, I think it's really important that we think of boundaries as they're not just brick walls that you put around yourself to stop yourself being taken advantage of. Your boundaries communicate what you're prepared to sacrifice, what you're going to commit to, what you're going to compromise on, what you'll say yes to, what you say no to. And you should have boundaries that you don't budge on for anything. And you should have flexible boundaries that you budge on a little, but not too much. And you should have easygoing boundaries. You need a range of boundaries, but you need to think about, well, so what does that look like for me in my relationship? And whether it's finances, whether it's the things that we do together, whether it's intimacy, whether it's how we relate to other people, what are the boundaries that are really important to me? And I'm going to stick with those boundaries. And a really silly example, but I think it's a good example. My daughter, who's my youngest, who's now 17, when she was about 15, she started dating a 16-year-old guy, and he was like the cool kid on the skate park, and she really was quite pleased with herself. He was the good-looking kid. Everyone wanted to date him, and now she was dating him. But like a few weeks in, he started to belittle some of her skills, trying to. So she plays the piano, and he was like taking the mick out of her for playing the piano. He was trying to control what she was wearing, so she dumped him, and she was really upset. She really didn't want to dump him, but he had tested her boundaries, and that was it. And her boundaries override what her heart is going to telling her to do, because often your heart is not going to tell you what is something that is smart. Heart-based decisions, it's all very nice having a gut-based decision, but often they're very flawed because they are directed and manipulated by all the biases that we have, all 180 of them. So we need to understand our boundaries. And with young children, for example, we can get them used to understanding what their boundaries are by getting them to communicate what is enough for them, and then respecting that enough. So I let my boys play fight all the time, but they have to respect each other's stop and enough. And these are just good ways of getting kids used to this whole issue of boundaries. So it's 45 minutes, and I've talked for quite a long time, and I want to hand back for any questions. And please do feel free to ask any questions that you want to ask, anything that I've covered. Anything that you think, actually, I'd love you to elaborate on something that you have covered a bit more, or something that I just haven't covered that you just want to hit me with a question out of the blue. That's cool. So are there any questions that you want to field? Siobhan?
Andrew, I've got a few questions, Andrew, from the Q&A. So if I could read those out to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've got a really good question for someone who, I'm not going to name people because they may want to be anonymous, but for someone who is completing the dissertation for their masters, which they're doing their dissertation about male victims of domestic abuse. And part of the dissertation is about how social workers could be better at understanding how male victims feel. So the question is, what's one piece of advice that you would give to a social worker in the situation of supporting a male victim? So what one piece of advice would you give a social worker?
I think as a male, if I'm speaking to a social worker, if I truly believe that the social worker has got an open mind and is ready to talk and listen and believe what I'm saying, that's a really big start. And I think something for guys, and well, certainly for me, years ago when I was sort of coming out of it, was just that sense of being believed, because also abusive people are very, very believable. My ex-wife is a master storyteller. She's very, very convincing. And in fact, in the family courts where there was some social service involvement with my daughters, one of the frustrations was that they just weren't really interested in what I had to say as a dad. They were very taken in by mum, because mum, my ex-wife, is very sort of middle class and well-spoken and knows how to play that game. So I think for men, I think it's just knowing that you've got someone that does believe you, that takes you seriously. That is so important.
Thank you for that.
It's more of, rather than a practical step, it's more sort of an attitude that you can pick up whether someone actually is really with you and believing you and taking you seriously.
It's really interesting just listening to you, Andrew, and I'm reflecting that actually I think that's what most people who are abused would say, you know, someone who is going to believe and listen. So it doesn't, you know, it's not so different, the male perspective or the female perspective or a child perspective, or that's an I suppose something that I think everybody's looking for. And then we've lots of questions. We ran out of time for all of them, but we've got a question. Do you still have trauma, and how did you learn to trust again?
Do you know, when I came out of the relationship, I was like, because I mean, I've got a wonderful mother, two great sisters. I've always got on well with women, like in a good way. And I came out of the relationship, and I was like, if I ever have another relationship, there's going to be prenups. You know, no one's taking me for advantage, because financially I got a very bad settlement as well. And so I was sort of came out all macho. This is how it's going to be from now on. And then part of the healing was I met a wonderful woman who is now my wife. And just having some time, I was around some really balanced friends who kind of helped me heal. I actually lived with my parents for a few years as well. I'm very blessed, as I'm a very privileged male, to have two amazing parents who just are they're wise, and they just worked with me over time. I think a lot of time has passed. That has helped. So it's 12 years since I came out of that relationship. And I think to some degree, because of the children, you have to just get on with it. It's horrendous, because you're reliving a lot of that trauma year after year. And I had a bit of an unusual situation that the girls are actually moved to my custody. They were removed from my ex-wife, but then my ex-wife years later tried to have that decision reversed. And there were all kinds of accusations made. So, I mean, I've had to live on and essentially be involved in warfare with her till it's closed off now, because they're out of court. They're because they're 17 and 20. So I think the kids, that the bad news with the kids is that it's meant I've had to stay connected to her for so long. But the good news is you just have to get on with it. And it hasn't been easy. It really hasn't. But a lot of time has passed. And I do find, obviously Brett has watched the TEDx talk. And that actually was a hugely healing experience for me. And I actually well up at the end of that. I get a bit emotional right at the end. You can see I just about hold it together. But that was a hugely healing thing, actually doing the TEDx talk, because obviously it's quite a big thing doing a TEDx talk. It's the first time my parents had really heard the whole thing in quite that way before as well. And it's been a lot easier since the TEDx talk, being honest, because it's good as well, because then people have been contacting me when, you know, a lot of women are contacting me saying, look, it happened to my brother, it happened to my uncle, he didn't report it, it was in a bad way. So knowing that your pain has helped someone is also incredibly therapeutic, very, very positive thing. So if ever you've got a pain, if you can possibly talk about it and share it, most likely it's going to help someone. Does that answer the question? I
think so. Absolutely, Andrew. Thank you. Thank you for that. And a lot of people saying thank you very much for opening up and for sharing that. Then we've got another question about and I suppose I'm reflecting as I'm thinking and reading the questions and seeing the questions about gender and my bias, and you know, as you were talking about these 180 biases. But there's a question about, were you ever tempted to fight back when things got physical?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question. I wasn't until the very end. And towards the very end, there were a couple of times where I definitely thought about it. And when I say I came close, my ex-wife wouldn't have known that. But in my mind, I knew I was dangerously close. And in fact, the candlestick, the picture of the candlestick, that incident was near the end. And it was round about that time where I remember thinking, I'm not putting up with this anymore. But thankfully, I didn't hit back. I didn't fight back. And the way I kind of reasoned it was, I know that I'm going to, this is such a troubled person that undoubtedly I'm going to end up in the family courts. And so I mustn't fight back. But definitely crossed my mind at the very end. It never did until the very end. But at the very end, yes, it crossed my mind. And I'm really glad that I didn't.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think we've still got time for a couple of other questions. There's been quite a few questions about children. So what impact do you think your situation had on children? And we've also had some questions more from a social work angle about how do we manage risk to children. I think a couple of the team who are children's social workers are actually helping with some of the questions about what would happen with children. But I think Dave, a team member, I think had a really good question about children that I think might be helpful if you could answer that, Andrew. So Dave, did you want to?
Yep, thank you, Siobhan. And Andrew, I can't thank you enough. When Brett suggested this webinar, my ears were like, yes, let's go. So thank you, man. And just to re-emphasize what the chat have been saying, thank you for opening up to us. So my question, and I've just worded it how I could because it's a bit of it's a subject, that's hard to question. In the event of a parent choosing to flee to protect themselves and leave the children behind, even if they know the children are safe, like they choose to flee to protect themselves, how do we as social workers or just a family member teach the kids that it's not their fault, but also that their parent didn't leave them and that their parent isn't bad? So that's a bit of a chunky question. I apologize. And I
don't know what how much time, and I guess how much time you get with the kids varies from area to area. When there was social service involvement with my daughters, one of the problems was you walk into the house and it's fine. It's just a nice-ish house. And, my ex-wife had done the baking and all of that. And the social services got involved because the school had reported in that my eldest had reported being attacked by a mum. And she had like bruising on her shoulder. And so they were called in, but they didn't really have very much time. It was the social worker herself was quite young, probably quite new in role from what I could work out. And they stayed for half an hour, had a coffee with mum and left, and that was it. And so I think time with children is so important, which is hard when you're under pressure and you've got stretched resources. But children are not going to open up very easily about what's truly going on for them and the impact on them. They're only going to do that when they get to know you. And this was some of the trouble that we've had. We've had very good experiences of CAFCAS and very bad experiences. The CAFCAS officers, there's one that really got close to them and got their trust and got an accurate picture. That's because she spent time with them. She went to their school. She made sure that she got to know them first before the questions became a bit more personal, I suppose. So they trusted her, they liked her, so they felt they could share with her, and they felt like she was their friend. So I think a lot of it comes down to a patient approach and knowing that it's going to take time with children. You have to build the rapport first. I'm not sure if that really answers your question.
No. So what you're saying is it all comes back to relationships, yeah?
Relationships and time. Yeah, absolutely. And it has had a bad effect on my daughters without a shadow of doubt. My eldest daughter, I think, has some quite serious mental health issues, and we're trying to get help with that, but that's not an easy one. They're both really, really been through it. And in the second court case we had, my youngest was at school at the time, a really good, well-liked pupil, known to help, doing very well academically and emotionally. But she started swearing at teachers, kicking off at school. She was in isolation, all in that time that she was at the family court, and it's getting really bad. I was getting call after call from school. And then when it stopped, everything changed. She went back to being the normal person at school. Not normal, but you know what I mean? The happy, balanced person that she is. And so these things have a huge impact. And, you know, I look at my daughters and, you know, it has had a big impact. It really has.
No, I really appreciate that, man. Obviously, one of the big things with kids is them taking the blame upon themselves.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was my thinking. But absolutely, relationships are key to everything. So yeah, thanks, Andrew, man. Honestly, thank you.
Thanks.
I just tried to tell you you're muted, Siobhan, while I was muted. So yeah.
Sorry, I'm muted, and you were muted, telling me I'm muted. You'd have thought we'd have got over this after 2 years, wouldn't you? But I was just saying thanks so much, Andrew. I think you know, some of the comments in the chat, people saying that they've really related to what you've shared with them tonight, and that they can see it a lot in some of the families that they're working with. So I think it's been really helpful tonight for lots of people, and caused lots of reflection. I've really taken a lot from what you've shared with us tonight myself. So thank you very much for that. And I do think, you know, that whole thing about time and relationships is really important, but perhaps more than anything, that whole thing about being ready to believe something that's very different that you perhaps wouldn't ordinarily think. So I think it's been really, really helpful for us tonight. So thank you very much. Lots of people in the chat saying how much they've benefited from tonight. So thank you so much. And also thank you for the resources, because I think it's actually been really helpful to hear about the resources. We do, as we've said to you, we do a follow-up email to people who've attended live, and so we'll send out those resources. But I am definitely going to be going and watching your TEDx. Thank you so much for sharing that.
No, and I think,
but I'm also...
You go.
Sorry,
I was going to say, if you're doing research around domestic abuse, and particularly the male side, I do really, really advocate the Mankind Initiative. The quality of their research is really, really good. There's loads of resource on their site.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Yeah, we will definitely send that out to people and follow it up. I know Brett's been putting things into the chat as we've been going along, but we'll also gather and make sure that we send all of those resources on to people. So thank you so much, Andrew. If you could just go on to that final slide for us, so that we can let people know what we've got coming up in the next couple of weeks. So the next couple of weeks are back to team-led sessions, because we've had 2 amazing sessions actually. Last week we looked at multiple perspectives on addiction, Andrew, which was really interesting. And I was thinking, as I was listening to you tonight, I was thinking there's so many similarities here with that thing about when you were talking earlier about walking on eggshells and behaving, and you're obsessing over maps and things like that. There were so many similar stories from last week. So we've had guests, amazing guests, helping us with the last couple of weeks. But next week we're back to looking at moral injury, which is a concept that you may not have heard of, but is incredibly relevant to all social workers. So you can register for that. I think that the link's gone into the chat. The week after that, we'll be looking at time management, actually trying to address what you've been saying, Andrew, about giving the time in the place where it's needed. And then we're going to be looking at relationship-based practice. So interesting, Andrew, that 2 of the things that you've said are really important are actually 2 of the things in our next 3 weeks worth of sessions. So it's over to the team for the next few weeks. We'll be doing moral injury next week, time management, and then we'll be going back to basics by looking at relationship-based practice. So if you want to register for the sessions coming up, then the links are going into the chat. Thank you very much for joining us this week, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us tonight. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening. Really appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
You're very welcome, Andrew. Thank you.